During the 2019-20 season, the Dallas Mavericks recorded the highest offensive rating in NBA history. Now, offensive rating had been increasing and continued to increase the next season for years, so it wasn't as crazy as you'd think, but they still had the best offense in the league in Luka Doncic's second year, and it was quite clearly the best offense, so we had to think, what could this offense be at the peak of Luka Doncic if in year 2 he's already leading the best offense in the league? And it's not like he had a crazy supporting cast at the time. Little did we know getting rid of Seth Curry would be a major mistake, which none of us predicted he would be that good, but we're not getting into that. And then next season, last season, they had another good offense. It was another top 10 offense. Offenses got better, but still, the Mavericks were another good offense, and that was including injuries at the start of the season, and again, a pretty average supporting cast, which led us to believe Luka's just kind of going to be a top 10 offense guy for the rest of his career. At least that's what I thought. So to my surprise, when they start this season 7-3 after hiring Jason Kidd, but have the 23rd ranked offense among the likes of the Orlando Magic, the New Orleans Pelicans, and other teams that are not in the same category as Dallas, are definitely not in the same category and have not been the last couple of years, that's surprising. And that just begs the question, particularly when you go a little bit further and you look at 3 of their games in which they've been abysmal. Well, 2 of their games, they've had absolutely abysmal performances against the Denver Nuggets and the Hawks, just 10 games into the season, which leaves me confused. Are the Dallas Mavericks actually a good team? Are they mediocre? Have they improved? What's going on in Dallas? Because they're 7-3, and it looks like it's good, but I don't quite know. Now, before I go any further, if you could drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you are, or if you haven't subscribed anyway, that would be much appreciated. But let's talk about Dallas. Now, I kind of did answer my own question a little bit just before, because with Dallas having only played 10 games, a major reason for their offensive rating being as bad as it is because 2 of those 10 games were absolute blowouts, in which they combined for 160 points against Atlanta and Denver. You get rid of the first game against Atlanta, and all of a sudden Dallas jump up to the 15th ranked offense, and I can imagine they'd be a top 10 offense if you exclude the game against Denver. But as good as that would be, we can't just exclude the bad games. That's the reason why Dallas have been confusing, because their bad has been really bad to start the season, and I wouldn't even say their good has been really good as in seasons past, because they haven't exactly blown out teams, and they haven't exactly had the toughest opposition, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But they've still won games, which is important. Now, I think if you look at the first 2 games, there's one pretty clear reason for the Mavericks struggling so much, and, well, that was because Luka was struggling. DeAndre Hunter and Aaron Gordon looked like fantastic matchups in terms of physical guys that were just harassing him all night long. If you also look at the start of the season, they weren't getting the same shot creation from Jalen Brunson, who now over the last few games, I think has given me more optimism for this Mavs team as a whole. I know Jalen Brunson giving me a lot of optimism for the Mavs. That's saying something, but he's been their second best player, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but he has been really improved the last several games, and he looks like he might be having a bit of a breakout season, which has been important. But the first few games, it was all Luka, and 2 good defenses, well, 2 good defensive players in Aaron Gordon and DeAndre Hunter were allowed to just harass him all night long, and he didn't really have any help. So I think that was a major reason, because we all know, regardless of how much help they get him, it's going to be Luka Doncic's team, and when he has a poor game, which he had in those 2 games, they struggled really badly. But now, looking forward, Jalen Brunson, the last 4 or 5 games, he's been immense. He has been immense. He started 2 of those games and was huge, absolutely huge. And then the last 2 games, he's come off the bench. And at first, I was a little bit skeptical. I'm like, surely you leave in Jalen Brunson, because he was averaging, what, like 28 points in his 2 games as a starter. But I haven't minded it, because you look at the bench the last few games, and it's looked pretty decent. Frank Ntilikina has actually been decent off the bench, yes. Reggie Bullock as well. The 2 guys they brought from New York have looked pretty good. Maxi Kleber, when he comes back, is a solid bench piece as well. And then you have Jalen Brunson, who's leading it and putting it all together. All of a sudden having one real key piece off the bench. And it's not like Brunson's not playing starter minutes. He's playing 35 minutes over the last few games, and he's been closing out games. But having him coming off the bench and then just having the team actually look competent in non-Luka minutes has been good, and that's where there's some optimism for me in terms of their offense turning around, because they have a little bit more depth there, adding in Ntilikina, adding in Bullock, who had a few different pieces to what they had last year. Maxi Kleber's been good. The less said about Willie Cauley-Stein, the better, but those guys have been good. Now, what's also worth noting, and is probably the most important part of all of this when it comes to the offense, we can talk about the personnel, but at the end of the day, on a Luka Doncic-led team, there's one thing that is more important than any. Obviously, him to play well, which is why in those 2 games he struggled. They lost, which is evident. But for the shooters to do well. And so far, he's not shooting well. Dorian Finney-Smith, no one's really shooting well. Like Tim Hardaway Jr., Brunson, those guys are shooting okay. Reggie Bullock. But no one is actually shooting very well. They're shooting 30% from 3. And that's the major reason why their offense is struggling, okay? You can put it down to anything, but it's the 3-point shooting. They're taking a number of threes, again, like they did last season and like they continue to. They're still creating a lot of open looks because it's Luka Doncic. He did it for Slovenia. With Mike Tobey and Vlatko Čančar, he was creating open looks at will. So he's going to do it for Dallas, and he's going to continue to do it. It's just about knocking down the shots. And we can talk about Kristaps Porzingis, but he's not going to hit 26% of his threes the whole season. Whether you think of him as a bum or whatever you think of him, he's not going to shoot that bad. He'll shoot 35%. I can pretty much guarantee that. Luka Doncic should get around that. Dorian Finney-Smith. These guys are going to improve their shooting, and that is going to be a huge, huge boost for this offense. So that's one thing that is very important. And also Porzingis, who I kind of touched on. There's a lot of ifs about Porzingis. I do believe he looks better defensively, and that's important, and I'll just talk about that in a second. But also, in terms of offense, if he can actually step up and be the guy that we think he can be, well, then maybe they can get back to being a top offense. Because you think about it, 2 seasons ago when they were the top offense, a lot of it came down to Porzingis playing a lot of minutes at the 5, spacing the floor really damn well, and helping them alongside Seth Curry and those guys. But that was a reason. Right now, offensively, okay. But let's talk about the defense, because although they're the 17th ranked defense, yeah, the numbers aren't really that flattering to the Mavericks, which is why they're confusing. But in fairness, in just 10 games, when you have a couple of blowouts, it really does throw the numbers just off tilt, okay? So we can't really get a good indicator of just how good this team is. We've seen them get blown out a couple of times against good teams. But again, I wouldn't say they're a flat track bully, because if you look at last season, they were 22-16 against teams above 500. So it's really hard to tell. It's still early, but I'm just trying to make sense of what's going on in Dallas. But if you look at a positive from their defensive end, Porzingis has been better. He's been particularly better defensively at the 5. He's shuffling his feet a little bit better. He looks more energized on that end of the floor. He looks more energized in general, and he does look like he's moving better. He's just not making any shots, which hasn't really been his issue the last couple of seasons. Last year in the playoffs, Pandemic P, yes, he struggled shooting. Yes, he struggled on the offense. But in general, he's still been able to piece together 20-point games pretty easily. It's been his defense that has been the issue. So if his defense can continue to be solid and continue to improve, and the Mavericks can continue to actually look good with him at the 5 and Brunson in the starting lineup, or Brunson in that closing lineup, and Luka Doncic and whoever else is around that, Reggie Bullock or Tim Hardaway Jr., whoever else they piece in that lineup, then all of a sudden, with his offense maybe coming together, there's the silver lining for what's going on in the season so far. That's what I'd take away from it, that Porzingis looks better, competent on defense, and they're still doing pretty well despite his offense being so bad, despite the shooting being so bad, despite Luka Doncic not even playing amazingly well. Obviously, he's still playing well. It's Luka Doncic, but compared to the last couple of seasons, he is down a little bit shooting the ball and just overall playing. But that's where there's some silver linings. The Mavericks have been able to win games, and you can look at their net rating and you can say they've been lucky, they've closed out some games, and they've been blown out. But also, 2 years ago, I keep bringing it back, but it's just an example of what a team can be. 2 years ago, the Mavericks were one of the best teams in the league, net rating-wise, fantastic offense, all of these things, and they still didn't have an amazing record, because at the end of the day, you got to close out the games. And so far, Dallas have been closing out the games, which is an improvement, and that is something to note. I think Jalen Brunson really helped them in a couple of those games. Obviously, Luka Doncic's amazing 3 against the Boston Celtics, but for them to be closing out games, that's an improvement. But if you were to ask me what my thoughts are on Dallas this early into the season, I think I'd be like pretty much all of you. I don't really know. I really don't, but I do believe there are some positives. They've looked more energized defensively. Even Luka has looked a bit more energized defensively. Kristaps Porzingis. They're getting the wins on the board. Remember, Dallas are also a team of runs from what we've seen over the last couple of seasons. For a team that shoots a lot of threes, for a team that is led by Luka Doncic, who can go on these unbelievable runs where he just puts up ridiculous numbers and starts shooting the 3-ball really well, because his 3-point shooting has always been a little bit inconsistent. They can go on these runs. They did it last season. They did it the year before. If they can start to go on a run and then look even better, they've already got the wins on the board. That's important because last season, they were actually really good for 80% of the season, but the 20% at the start where they had injuries and where they couldn't win games, that's what hindered them in the end. So for Dallas to get these wins, despite not really playing that well, I think we can all agree, but to have Jalen Brunson look like he might be taking a breakout step, I still believe in Hardaway Jr. and all of these guys as shooters. I don't think they've lost their shooting, even though Hardaway Jr. has been their best shooter so far, but you get what I mean in terms of all these guys should come back to the mean when it comes to shooting because they're still creating open looks and it's still Luka Doncic at the end of the day. And also defensively, I would say they do look a bit better as well. Porzingis looks better. That him at the 5 looks better in some closing lineups. If he can actually make some shots, well, the potential of this team might be there. At the end of the day, it's a Luka Doncic-led team. You can't rule them out. You really can't, because you look at what he did for Slovenia at the Olympics. You look at what he did for Dallas last season. Some people hold it against him. You're an idiot. I'm just going to be honest. If you hold it against Luka for not winning that series when he took Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, and a much better supporting cast to 7 games in that series, when who was his best player? Tim Hardaway Jr. in that playoff run? You're an idiot. It looks like maybe the defense has improved. I don't mind the supporting pieces. Don't know if they're moving the needle yet. I think it still comes down to Porzingis. Hate saying it because I keep saying it, but he's the dude that can average 25 and 10, and he did it as recently as just a year and a half ago in the bubble, or a year ago, whenever that was. So that's all I've got to say. The Dallas Mavericks are very confusing. They're not bad. I don't know if they're good, but they're winning games, and that's important because I do believe they're going to be better as the season goes on. In terms of my thoughts on Jason Kidd, still early in the season. That's what I'll say. It's still early in the season, but they're winning games, okay? So that's one thing. That's a positive.